The fastest way to discover who really owns a bridge is to close it for one morning. At 6:03 on a cold spring morning, I stood beside a line of fresh barricades and watched an entire neighborhood realize a truth they had ignored for years. Red and blue emergency lights reflected off the steel guardrails. County deputies stood calmly near the entrance. Engines idled. Drivers leaned out of windows. Coffee cups sat forgotten on dashboards. And at the center of the growing chaos stood Diane Whitmore, the president of the Homeowners Association, staring at me as if I had just locked the front door to her house. The air smelled like river water and wet concrete. A light fog drifted above the surface of the creek beneath the bridge. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. Then the shouting started. Residents stepped out of their vehicles. Questions flew in every direction. Why was the bridge closed? How long would it last? Who authorized this? Diane pointed directly at me. Her face had turned bright red with frustration. She demanded that the deputies remove the barricades immediately. One of them calmly handed her a document. She barely looked at it. She was too busy staring at me. The strange part was that none of this should have surprised her. 3 months earlier, I had sent the HOA a certified letter. 2 months earlier, I sent another. Then another. Every document explained the same thing. The bridge required major structural repairs. Engineers estimated the work would cost $380,000. The bridge was aging. The support systems needed attention. The maintenance obligations were clearly outlined. The Homeowners Association had responsibilities under a decades-old agreement. They refused every single time. Now hundreds of residents were trapped on one side of the creek because the only bridge connecting their community to the outside world sat behind a row of barricades. I watched Diane march toward me across the pavement. Her expensive shoes clicked sharply against the concrete deck. Behind her, a line of vehicles stretched nearly a quarter-mile down the road. Morning sunlight slowly climbed above the trees, casting golden reflections across the steel railings. The bridge looked beautiful. It always had. My grandfather built the original version nearly 60 years earlier, when this entire area consisted of ranch land and dirt roads. Back then, nobody imagined a large residential community would someday depend on it. Nobody imagined thousands of daily crossings. Nobody imagined a homeowners association president would one day stand on it demanding rights she never actually possessed. Diane stopped a few feet away and asked the question that changed everything. How could you do this to the community? I almost laughed. Not because the situation was funny, but because the answer was sitting in her purse. In her office. In every certified letter she ignored. In every invoice she refused to discuss. In every engineering report her board dismissed. She believed this bridge belonged to the community because the community used it every day. That was her mistake. People often confuse access with ownership. They mistake convenience for entitlement. They assume that because something has always been available, it always will be. As the crowd grew larger around the barricades, one deputy quietly adjusted a traffic cone. Another reviewed paperwork with a county official. Nobody appeared nervous. Nobody appeared uncertain. The law was very clear. The documents were very clear. The bridge was very clear. Standing there in the morning light, watching an entire neighborhood confront reality for the first time, I knew the story was only beginning. Because the bridge beneath our feet was not the real issue. The real issue was that Diane Whitmore had spent years acting like she owned something that never belonged to her in the first place. The bridge was never supposed to become the most important thing my family owned. My grandfather used to laugh whenever people called it an asset. He would lean against the old railing, spit into the creek below, and say that a bridge was just a way to get from one side to the other. Standing there that morning while frustrated drivers stared at barricades and deputies reviewed paperwork, I found myself thinking about him. The irony would have made him smile. The structure he built as a practical solution to a local problem had become the center of a legal battle affecting an entire community. Long before Willow Creek existed, the land surrounding the creek was mostly ranches, hay fields, and scattered farms. The county had discussed building a public crossing several times, but the funding never appeared. During heavy rain, the creek could become nearly impossible to cross safely. School buses had to take long detours. Feed deliveries arrived late. Emergency vehicles lost valuable time. My grandfather grew tired of waiting for someone else to solve the problem. So he built the first bridge himself. It was not fancy. It was not designed to impress anyone. It was built because people needed it. Over the years, the structure was upgraded, reinforced, expanded, and modernized. My father invested money into repairs. I invested money into inspections and maintenance. Every bolt, every support beam, every section of guardrail represented decades of responsibility. The bridge never belonged to the county. It never belonged to a developer. It never belonged to a homeowners association. It remained private property, sitting on private land. The only reason most people forgot that fact was because we never gave them a reason to remember. The morning sun continued climbing above the trees as traffic backed up farther along the road. Drivers checked their phones. Parents worried about getting children to school. Delivery trucks sat motionless. Looking at the growing line of vehicles, I understood why emotions were running high. The bridge had become essential. Thousands of crossings happened every week. Entire routines depended on it. Yet dependency does not create ownership. That lesson would eventually become very expensive for the homeowners association. I walked toward the center of the bridge and rested my hand against the steel railing. The metal felt cool from the night air. Beneath me, water moved steadily through the creek, carrying leaves and small branches downstream. The sound was calming. It always had been. As a kid, I spent countless afternoons fishing from the bank with my father. He taught me how to tie knots, repair equipment, and respect property. One lesson came up more than any other. If you own something important, eventually someone will try to treat it like it belongs to them. At the time, I thought he was talking about tools, tractors, or cattle. Years later, I realized he was talking about responsibility itself. Ownership is not just a privilege. Ownership is a burden. It means paying bills nobody wants to pay. It means handling problems nobody else notices. It means maintaining things that everyone uses but few appreciate. For decades, my family carried that burden without complaint. We repaired storm damage. We funded inspections. We addressed structural concerns. We protected access for everyone who depended on the crossing. Then Willow Creek arrived. Then thousands of residents began driving across the bridge every day. Then people slowly stopped seeing the structure as something my family maintained and started seeing it as something they were entitled to use forever. That misunderstanding did not happen overnight. It took years. And at the center of it all stood one person who would eventually push that misunderstanding farther than anyone else ever had. Diane Whitmore did not arrive all at once. She arrived the way most problems do, slowly enough that people stopped noticing the change. When Willow Creek was first developed, the homeowners association operated like most others. They collected dues, maintained landscaping, organized community events, and handled routine complaints. Nobody paid much attention to who sat on the board because nobody had a reason to. Then Diane became president. The first time I met her was during a community expansion meeting nearly 7 years earlier. The room smelled like fresh coffee and printer ink. Folding chairs filled the town hall. Developers stood near presentation boards showing future phases of construction. Diane introduced herself before the meeting even started. She wore a bright smile, spoke confidently, and seemed to know everyone in the room. At first, I actually liked her. She appeared organized. She appeared competent. She appeared genuinely interested in improving the community. Looking back, I realized those qualities were exactly what made her so effective. The problem was not that Diane lacked intelligence. The problem was that she believed every successful project automatically justified itself. If growth benefited enough people, she assumed any obstacle standing in the way should eventually move aside. As Willow Creek expanded, her influence expanded with it. New neighborhoods appeared. New residents arrived. New roads connected developments that once sat miles apart. Property values climbed. Local businesses opened. Everywhere Diane looked, growth seemed to confirm her worldview. The community kept getting larger, and she increasingly viewed herself as one of the people responsible for making it happen. The bridge became part of that mindset. At first, she treated it with appreciation. Then she treated it with familiarity. Eventually, she treated it with ownership. The shift happened so gradually most people never noticed. Community newsletters referred to access improvements involving the bridge. Planning documents referenced traffic studies using the bridge. Residents discussed maintenance concerns involving the bridge. Nobody stopped to ask the most important question. Whose bridge was it? One afternoon, several years before the conflict began, I attended an HOA planning session regarding future traffic increases. Large maps covered the walls. Engineers discussed projections. Consultants reviewed transportation reports. Diane stood near the front of the room, directing the conversation. At one point, an engineer mentioned the bridge would require ongoing structural oversight because increased usage would place additional stress on the crossing. Diane nodded and replied with a sentence I never forgot. The community will continue using it as needed. Not request. Not coordinate. Not discuss. Use. The wording seemed minor at the time. Now I recognize it as a glimpse into how she viewed the situation. The bridge was no longer private infrastructure in her mind. It was part of the community system. Something expected. Something permanent. Something available regardless of cost or responsibility. The years that followed only reinforced that belief. Every morning, thousands of tires rolled across the deck. School buses crossed it. Delivery trucks crossed it. Contractors crossed it. Emergency vehicles crossed it. Residents crossed it without giving a second thought to the family maintaining it. Diane encouraged that mindset because it supported her larger vision. The community grew increasingly dependent on access while becoming increasingly disconnected from ownership. By the time she became one of the most recognizable figures in Willow Creek, many residents honestly believed the crossing belonged to them. Diane never corrected that assumption. Why would she? From her perspective, the bridge had become a public necessity. And if something feels necessary long enough, people start convincing themselves it has always been theirs. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon during one of the hottest weeks of the summer. The air shimmered above the pavement. Cicadas buzzed from the trees along the creek. Even the steel railings felt warm enough to burn your hand if you touched them for too long. I was standing near the southern approach conducting a routine inspection when my phone rang. The number belonged to an engineering firm I had hired several months earlier to perform a comprehensive structural review. Their lead engineer sounded serious before he even started speaking. That was never a good sign. An hour later, I sat in a conference room reviewing a report thick enough to stop a door from closing. The smell of fresh paper and printer toner filled the room. Charts, photographs, stress analyses, and inspection notes covered nearly every page. Most of it was technical language only engineers fully appreciated. One section, however, was impossible to misunderstand. The bridge required substantial repairs. Not cosmetic repairs. Not routine maintenance. Major structural work designed to ensure long-term safety and reliability. The estimated cost exceeded $380,000. I stared at the number for a long time. Outside the window, traffic moved steadily through town. Inside, the engineer calmly explained support reinforcement schedules, load distribution concerns, drainage upgrades, and preventive measures. None of it was shocking. Structures age. Steel ages. Concrete ages. Responsibility does not disappear simply because maintenance becomes expensive. The problem was never the cost itself. The problem was who should share it. Over the following week, my attorney and I reviewed every agreement connected to the crossing. Historical access arrangements. Maintenance records. Property documents. Easement language. Usage data. The more we reviewed, the clearer the situation became. Thousands of residents depended on the crossing every day. The Homeowners Association benefited enormously from uninterrupted access. Their own planning documents acknowledged that reality repeatedly. So I did what any reasonable property owner would do. I sent them the report. I sent them the supporting documentation. I sent them a detailed explanation of projected costs. Then I sent an invoice reflecting their share of the responsibility. The certified package arrived at the HOA office the following Monday. For nearly 2 weeks, I heard nothing. No questions. No requests for clarification. No negotiation. Silence. Then came the board meeting. The community center was packed. Folding chairs filled the room. Residents lined the walls. Ceiling fans turned lazily overhead while people fanned themselves with meeting agendas. Diane stood at the front holding a copy of the engineering report. She flipped through several pages before setting it aside with an expression that immediately told me how the evening would unfold. According to Diane, the invoice was unreasonable. According to Diane, the Homeowners Association had no obligation to contribute. According to Diane, the bridge represented a private matter that should remain a private expense. Several residents nodded. Others applauded. I remember sitting quietly near the back of the room, listening to arguments that ignored decades of history. What surprised me most was not the rejection itself. It was the confidence behind it. Diane did not merely disagree. She acted as though the question should never have been asked, as though responsibility belonged exclusively to me while access belonged permanently to everyone else. When the meeting ended, people filed into the parking lot discussing vacations, school schedules, and weekend plans. Meanwhile, the most expensive mistake of Diane Whitmore's presidency had just been made, and she did not even realize it yet. The rejection spread through Willow Creek faster than I expected. Within days, people who had never attended a board meeting suddenly had opinions about me. The strange thing was that most of them had never seen the engineering report. They had never reviewed the inspection findings. They had never read the agreements connected to the crossing. What they knew came from conversations, newsletters, social media posts, and Diane's version of events. According to the story making its way through the community, I was trying to force homeowners to pay for my private property. The details changed depending on who told it, but the conclusion remained the same. I was the problem. I first noticed the shift one Saturday morning while stopping at a local diner for breakfast. The smell of bacon, coffee, and fresh biscuits filled the air. Normally, people greeted me with a wave or stopped to talk about weather, cattle prices, or local sports. That morning felt different. Conversations paused when I walked in. A few people nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Sitting alone in a booth near the window, I listened to fragments of discussion drifting through the room. Most of it centered around the same idea. Why should the community pay? From their perspective, the answer seemed obvious. The crossing sat on my property. Therefore, the responsibility belonged entirely to me. Nobody talked about decades of usage. Nobody talked about legal agreements. Nobody talked about shared obligations. Simplicity is attractive, even when it ignores reality. The weeks that followed became increasingly frustrating. Every morning, hundreds of vehicles crossed the structure. School buses rolled over the deck. Delivery trucks passed through. Landscaping crews, contractors, utility workers, and residents all depended on access. The bridge remained essential to daily life. Yet many of the same people benefiting from it openly criticized the idea of contributing to its preservation. One afternoon, I received a call from a local contractor I had known for years. He sounded uncomfortable before he even explained why he was calling. Several homeowners had approached him about the situation. They believed I was exaggerating repair needs. Some even claimed the engineering report was created simply to pressure the association into paying money. I thanked him for the information and ended the call. Then I sat staring out at the creek for nearly 20 minutes. The water moved quietly beneath the supports. Sunlight reflected off the surface in small flashes of silver. Above me, tires continued rolling across the deck every few seconds. The sound had become part of the landscape. Constant, reliable, expected. That expectation was exactly what Diane understood better than anyone. She knew most residents would support convenience over responsibility. She knew people rarely question access until access disappears. The Homeowners Association board doubled down during its next meeting. Public statements described the invoice as unreasonable. Community updates framed the dispute as a disagreement between a private owner and the neighborhood. Residents applauded. Diane smiled. The board congratulated itself for protecting homeowner interests. Meanwhile, nobody asked the question that mattered. What happens if the owner stops carrying the entire burden alone? By the end of the month, I had become something of a local villain. Social media discussions painted me as greedy. Rumors circulated about hidden motives. Strangers who had never met me seemed remarkably confident about my intentions. Through it all, the bridge continued doing exactly what it had always done. It carried traffic. It connected people. It supported an entire community. Every passing day increased dependence. Every passing day increased liability. Every passing day strengthened a legal position that Diane did not even realize was forming against her. The more the Homeowners Association refused responsibility, the closer they moved toward a mistake that would eventually leave them standing in front of barricades wondering how everything had gone so wrong. The turning point arrived in the least dramatic place imaginable. There were no heated confrontations, no emergency meetings, no sudden confessions. It began inside a records archive located in the basement of the county administration building. The room smelled like dust, aging paper, and old cardboard. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with decades of surveys, easements, property agreements, and development records. By that point, Attorney Grant Sullivan and I had spent weeks reviewing every document connected to the crossing. Most of what we found confirmed things we already knew. Ownership records, maintenance histories, inspection reports. Nothing that fundamentally changed the situation. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, Grant called and told me to meet him immediately. His voice sounded different. Not excited. Grant rarely sounded excited about anything. Confident was the better word. When I arrived, he was seated at a long table surrounded by photocopies and survey maps. Rain tapped steadily against a narrow basement window. A yellow legal pad sat beside an open file folder. The moment I sat down, he slid a document across the table. The paper looked ordinary. Faded signatures, aging typeface, standard legal formatting. Yet the contents changed everything. Decades earlier, when the original residential development received approval to expand beyond the creek, a formal access agreement had been negotiated with my grandfather. The county required guaranteed access. Developers required a crossing. My grandfather required protection. The result was a carefully written agreement establishing long-term usage rights for future residents. At first glance, it appeared to support the homeowners association. Then Grant pointed to a paragraph buried deep within the document. One paragraph, one clause, one sentence that nobody seemed to remember existed. The agreement granted access rights contingent upon proportional participation in maintenance, repair, and structural preservation obligations whenever significant work became necessary. I read the language twice, then a third time. The wording was remarkably clear. Access rights existed because responsibilities existed. The two concepts were connected. Neither stood alone. Somehow, over the years, everyone remembered the benefit and forgot the obligation. The rain continued falling outside while Grant explained the implications. Historical board records referenced the agreement repeatedly during the early years of development. Older meeting minutes discussed maintenance reserves specifically connected to future structural expenses. At some point, leadership changed. Residents changed. Institutional memory disappeared. The obligation remained. Nobody paid attention to it anymore. Diane certainly had not. The realization felt almost surreal. For months, the debate had centered around whether I was asking too much, whether the invoice was fair, whether the homeowners association should contribute. Suddenly those arguments became secondary. The real issue was compliance with an agreement already in place. This was not about creating responsibility. The responsibility already existed. The bridge outside continued carrying traffic exactly as before. School buses crossed it. Delivery trucks crossed it. Residents crossed it. Yet beneath every tire rolling across the deck sat a legal reality that nobody in Willow Creek understood. The more I thought about it, the more obvious the situation became. Diane believed the community possessed permanent rights because people had used the crossing for years. Grant understood something different. Rights often survive only because obligations are honored. Remove one side of the equation, and the other becomes vulnerable. As we gathered the documents that afternoon, thunder rolled softly across the county. The sound echoed through the basement walls. Grant placed the agreement back into its folder and smiled slightly. It was the first smile I had seen from him since this entire dispute began. We finally had what we needed. Not an argument. Not a theory. Not an opinion. We had the clause that connected every invoice, every rejection, every meeting, and every decision Diane Whitmore had made. And she had absolutely no idea it existed. Most people assume the strongest legal move is the first one. Grant Sullivan believed the strongest legal move was often the last one. A week after discovering the forgotten clause, I sat across from him in his office while afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds and painted long lines across stacks of case files. The room smelled like coffee, leather, and old paper. I expected him to file something immediately. I expected emergency notices, court hearings, and aggressive legal action. Instead, he handed me a copy of the agreement and told me to wait. At first, I thought he was joking. For months, I had watched the Homeowners Association dismiss every warning. I had watched Diane reject every opportunity to resolve the problem. Now we finally possessed the document that connected everything together, and his advice was patience. Grant leaned back in his chair and explained the situation carefully. One final opportunity for Diane to acknowledge the obligation voluntarily. If she refused again after receiving complete documentation, the record would become impossible to dispute. The strategy frustrated me, but it made sense. Rights are strongest when every reasonable alternative has already been offered. So we prepared one final package: the engineering report, the maintenance records, the historical agreement, the forgotten clause, the cost breakdown. Every document was organized, indexed, and professionally presented. Nothing emotional, nothing dramatic, just facts. The package arrived at the HOA office 3 days later. Then we waited. The following week felt longer than the previous 6 months combined. Every morning, traffic rolled across the crossing exactly as it always had. School buses rattled over the deck. Delivery trucks passed beneath the shade of the trees. Residents drove to work without a second thought. The sound of tires humming across the concrete echoed from sunrise until well after dark. Looking at it all, I understood why Diane felt invincible. The system appeared permanent. The community functioned normally. Nothing suggested consequences were approaching. Then the response finally arrived. Grant called me before I even opened the email. His tone told me everything. Diane had rejected the request again. Not only rejected it, but dismissed it entirely. According to the board's official position, the association still bore no responsibility. They argued that continued access should remain uninterrupted regardless of maintenance disputes. Reading the letter, I felt strangely calm. Months earlier, the rejection would have made me angry. Now it felt different. Predictable. Necessary, even. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place exactly where Grant expected it would. That evening, I drove to the creek and parked near the southern approach. The air smelled of river water and freshly cut grass. Crickets chirped from the tree line. The setting sun reflected off the railings in streaks of gold and orange. Vehicle after vehicle crossed overhead. Families returning home. Teenagers heading to practice. Delivery drivers finishing routes. Everyone depended on the crossing. Most had no idea how close they were to learning a lesson about ownership. Grant filed the necessary paperwork the next morning. From that point forward, events moved quietly but steadily. Notices were issued. Documentation was reviewed. Timelines were established. Nobody made dramatic speeches. Nobody threatened anyone. The law simply followed its process. Diane continued acting as though nothing had changed. Community newsletters celebrated future projects. Board members discussed landscaping upgrades and neighborhood events. The confidence remained. The certainty remained. Yet beneath the surface, the situation had already shifted. The final refusal had closed every remaining door. Standing beside the creek at sunset a few days later, listening to water move beneath the structure my grandfather built, I realized the dispute was no longer about money. It was about accountability. Diane had been given every opportunity to choose responsibility. She chose denial instead. And sometimes the most expensive decision a person can make is believing there will never be consequences for saying no one more time. The morning everything changed began in complete silence. Long before sunrise, the crossing sat empty beneath a blanket of fog drifting above the creek. The water moved slowly beneath the supports, carrying reflections of distant lights along the surface. The air smelled of wet earth, river water, and freshly cut grass from the maintenance crews that had worked nearby earlier in the week. Standing near the southern approach, I watched county vehicles arrive one by one. Their headlights cut through the darkness before fading as engines shut down. Nobody rushed. Nobody raised their voice. The process felt calm, professional, and remarkably ordinary considering what was about to happen. Deputies reviewed paperwork beneath portable lights. Traffic barricades were unloaded from trailers. Temporary signs were positioned near the entrance. Everything occurred exactly according to plan. The law did not arrive dramatically. It arrived with clipboards, documentation, and procedure. By the time the first hints of sunrise appeared beyond the trees, the crossing was officially restricted. The barricades stretched across both approaches. Reflective markers glowed in the morning light. A deputy quietly adjusted one of the signs while another reviewed final documents. Then the first vehicle appeared. A delivery van approached from the subdivision side, slowed, and stopped. The driver stared at the barricades for several seconds before speaking with a deputy. A few minutes later, more vehicles arrived. Then more. Within half an hour, a line had formed. Engines idled. Brake lights glowed red through the fog. People stepped out of their cars holding coffee cups and phones. Questions spread quickly. Confusion arrived before frustration. Frustration arrived before understanding. The growing crowd reminded me of water backing up behind a dam. At exactly the moment Grant predicted, Diane Whitmore arrived. Her luxury SUV pulled toward the front of the line before stopping abruptly near the entrance. She stepped out carrying a folder beneath one arm. Even from a distance, I could see the confidence in her expression. She clearly believed this situation could be solved with a conversation. That confidence lasted less than 5 minutes. A deputy handed her the documentation. She read the first page, then the second. Then she started reading portions again. The expression on her face changed slowly. Not shock, realization. The kind that arrives when someone finally understands that a warning was never a bluff. Around us, residents gathered in small groups discussing possible detours. Some called employers. Others contacted schools. Delivery schedules unraveled. Morning routines disappeared. The entire community had organized its life around uninterrupted access, and now access depended upon obligations nobody wanted to acknowledge. The rising sun painted the steel railings gold. Every beam, every support, every section of concrete seemed brighter than usual. For years, people crossed the structure without thinking about who maintained it. Now they were looking at it differently, not as a convenience, not as a public utility, as private infrastructure connected to private responsibility. Grant arrived shortly after 7 o'clock carrying another set of documents. He moved calmly through conversations, answering questions and explaining the legal framework. There were no dramatic speeches, no arguments, just facts, historical agreements, maintenance obligations, repeated refusals, final notices, compliance requirements. The story became clearer with every explanation. Residents who had spent months hearing only one version of events suddenly encountered the complete picture. By mid-morning, the atmosphere had shifted. The frustration remained, but the target was changing. People began asking why the issue had not been addressed earlier, why warnings had been ignored, why opportunities for cooperation had been rejected. Diane spent most of the morning moving between groups, making calls, reviewing paperwork, and searching for solutions. Yet every path led back to the same reality. The agreement existed. The obligations existed. The refusals existed. As the sun climbed higher above the creek and the line of vehicles stretched farther into the distance, one thing became impossible to ignore. The crossing had not closed because of a sudden decision. It had closed because months of warnings, documents, invoices, and opportunities had been dismissed. And now the consequences were standing in plain sight for everyone to see. 3 months after the closure, the crossing looked completely different. Fresh steel railings reflected sunlight across the creek. Reinforced supports disappeared beneath newly finished protective coatings. Updated drainage systems lined the approaches. The entire structure felt stronger, cleaner, and more secure than it had in decades. Standing near the center on a warm autumn afternoon, I listened to tires roll smoothly across the surface and realized something surprising. The bridge sounded different. For years, I had grown accustomed to subtle rattles, vibrations, and echoes that came with age. Those sounds were gone now. In their place was the steady hum of traffic moving safely over a structure finally receiving the attention it needed. The resolution happened much faster than anyone expected. Once the closure forced reality into the open, negotiations suddenly became productive. The Homeowners Association could no longer pretend the obligations did not exist. Residents demanded answers. Historical records were reviewed. Legal counsel became involved. Facts replaced assumptions. Within weeks, agreements were reached regarding funding responsibilities and future maintenance planning. The repair project moved forward. Construction crews arrived. Engineers supervised the work. Progress became visible almost immediately. Every bolt tightened, every support reinforced, and every improvement completed felt like a small correction to years of neglect. Diane Whitmore remained president long enough to witness the outcome. That alone seemed fitting. The same person who spent months insisting responsibility belonged elsewhere eventually sat through meetings where the historical agreement was discussed line by line. She was never portrayed as a villain. The truth was more complicated than that. Diane genuinely believed she was protecting homeowner interests. Her mistake was assuming benefits could exist without obligations. She viewed access as permanent. The law viewed access as conditional. In the end, reality proved stronger than assumptions. As for the residents, many surprised me. Once they understood the full story, attitudes changed dramatically. People who once criticized me began asking thoughtful questions. Some even apologized. Others admitted they had never considered who paid for inspections, repairs, and long-term maintenance. For years, the crossing had functioned so reliably that ownership became invisible. People noticed the convenience, but not the responsibility supporting it. That lesson extended far beyond one bridge. Ownership often remains unnoticed until something breaks. One evening, near the completion of the project, I walked the entire length of the structure alone. The air smelled of fresh paint, river water, and cut lumber. The creek below reflected orange and gold colors from the setting sun. Halfway across, I stopped beside the railing and looked downstream. The view had not changed since childhood. The same trees lined the banks. The same water moved steadily toward the horizon. The same land stretched beyond the creek. I thought about my grandfather building the original crossing. I thought about my father maintaining it year after year. I thought about the countless mornings spent listening to traffic pass overhead while carrying responsibilities most people never noticed. Then I looked down at a small steel plate mounted near one of the repaired sections. The contractor had installed it after completion. It was simple, just a project identification marker. Yet seeing it there reminded me of something important. Structures survive because someone accepts responsibility for them. That truth applies to bridges, communities, businesses, and families. As the last light faded from the sky, I rested my hand on the new railing and listened to another stream of vehicles cross safely toward home. The crossing remained open. The community remained connected. The repairs were complete. Most importantly, the principle my grandfather believed in all those years ago remained intact. People crossed that bridge every day because my family built it. They kept crossing it because the law remembered who owned it. And sometimes the strongest form of justice is not taking something away. Sometimes it is simply reminding everyone whose responsibility it was all along.